you to all the individuals who spoke. Good afternoon, students, alumni, and friends. Welcome officially to our AACC 40th anniversary virtual celebration kickoff event. I am Dean Juliana Yee, and I'm joining today's event from the unceded lands of the Pagasiat Wapangers and Wampanoag peoples, known to us as Fairfield, Connecticut. It is my honor to have served as the current director of the AACC, the third oldest of its kind to exist on a U.S. college campus, and I've done so for the last 3 amazing years. And I know for a fact that I stand on the shoulders of giants who have held this position before me, and the many students, faculty, and staff who have dedicated their time, energy, and resources to the AACC in different ways throughout these past 4 decades. I'm deeply grateful for the opportunity to also contribute towards shaping this historical space in my current role alongside Assistant Director Shiraz Iqbal, who without his support, I would not be able to do half of the things that we all do. So as we begin thinking and talking about commemorating the AACC's 40th anniversary back in 2019 with students, staff, alumni shortly after ASA's 50th anniversary conference and celebration, I don't think any of us ever imagined that a pandemic would change all our worlds in the ways that it did this past year. We have each experienced immeasurable loss, and I'm sure we will be kind of still healing from a lot of the losses that we have experienced. So I would appreciate if you could all just join me in a moment of silence to acknowledge those lives lost to the viral and racial pandemics in the US and across the globe. Thank you. I also want to thank Travis Nguyen and Sarika Mehta for being our ASL interpreters for today's event and making our event more accessible. And as much as Zoom has caused a lot of fatigue, it has also become clearly a space for connection, healing, learning, building critical hope and joy as we look to better days ahead. And when I say we look to better days ahead, I'm not just thinking of returning to how everything was exactly the way it was before the coronavirus, but to really take lessons learned and the concerns brought to light for us to build a better tomorrow for every one of us, not just some of us. And I'm honestly personally heartened by the over 300 of you who registered for today's event. And I know you'll be coming in and out throughout the 2.5 hours. And I know that while for those of us who identify as Asian American, it can be easy to feel paralyzed by fear or be in constant anger about the ongoing anti-Asian violence in the US or just overall violence against marginalized peoples all over the globe that we are experiencing. I am reminded, however, that the term Asian American was really born out of a desire to unite the Asian diaspora and be in solidarity with Black and Latinx student groups to form the Third World Liberation Front. So I hope that today you will allow yourselves to be inspired by the speakers, the panels, and the virtual history projects that are featured in the next 2.5 hours, because we need every one of us to be committed to this collective good over our individual comfort. And so with that, it is also my pleasure to introduce Yale College's first Asian American Dean, Marvin Chun, to just say a few words, in commemoration of this special kind of kickoff for the 40th anniversary. He has been an incredible support for the AACC and the cultural centers writ large, and has honestly had the most difficult job of taking us through a pandemic. And so without further ado, I'm going to hand the virtual mic over to Dean Chun.
Thank you, Deanie. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you're zooming in from. I really wish we could be celebrating in person, but we cannot let this important anniversary pass without at least gathering virtually. And so thank you all for coming. I'm grateful to Deanie for starting with that moment of silence because this year was so hard. I can share the perspective with students currently on campus or at Yale enrolled that I've been at Yale for 21 years and I've never seen anything even close to as hard as this year has been. And for alumni who are Zooming in, just our students are just so admirable for having gone through this year, resilient, strong, and as upbeat as they could be. Campus life, as I'm sure home life is for many of you, was so incredibly constrained, and it's extra hard for someone in their prime years of 18 to 21, college years. And on campus, we've really experienced a lot of loss of, we've lost so many friends, teachers on campus and beyond in our families around the world. And that is always hard, but the activities and the kind of things that you would do to heal and restore yourselves, they've been severely curtailed, just making things even worse. We fortunately at Yale, we were able to keep the campus safe and avoided major outbreaks. But these protections of physical health came at the expense of mental health and wellness. And even as we look positively forward to returning to normal, we should remember what a difficult year this has been. And if the pandemic was not hard enough on campus and at home, we know, as Deanie mentioned, that this pandemic has worsened in inequalities around the world, in this country, even very close around us. We need to have in our thoughts and prayers so many areas of the world where the pandemic continues to ravage families, especially in India and surrounding countries. Right now, they are very much in our thoughts and prayers. And here in the United States, again, this year, when we think about this year, we really cannot forget how this, very tragic rise in racist violence against all people of color. I've always empathized. I think we always try to empathize with anyone experiencing bias. But this year's rise in anti-Asian violence, I think, feels personal to this community because the victims look like our grandparents and parents and our relatives and our friends. It's just, when you read the news or hear about it, about the victims, I think it really strikes a deep chord, and I understand why everyone is so upset. And so we need to continue to call out and speak up against racist acts until they stop. And that may be a long time, but we have to keep our focus on that. And we need to find strength in each other in this community, especially this AACC community, this great, strong, beautiful community, where I hope that our students, I hope that our alumni always feel a sense of inclusion and belonging to this AAC community and to the broader Yale in which it resides, bridging with all the other beautiful communities around Yale and around New Haven and beyond. And to identify the support, just I think on a positive note, to identify support within Yale, within AACC, we just need to look around on this Zoom room, at your friends around campus, at your friends on Facebook pages that you stay connected to as alumni. We have to remember what great strides Asian Americans have made at Yale. Right now, Asian Americans and Asian students of Asian descent, it's more than 20% of the undergraduate population on campus. It's 1 out of 5, a little more than 1 out of 5 of our students identify as Asian. And you all are valued in your diverse friend groups. You are serving as leaders in all kinds of organizations around campus. You are represented in the administration in many different ways, including my having the honor of serving as Dean of Yale College, including extraordinary colleagues like Dean Juliana Yi as a Dean of the AACC, and also Director, Assistant Director Shiraz Iqbal. We're really grateful for your leadership, and we have Asian representation in two of the 14 college heads, and several of our, just all over the campus. Many of our deans are also Asian, and so I think students can feel supported by administrative colleagues who look like them. And as of course, Yale strives to be a place without boundaries of color, socioeconomic background, or even interest and hobbies. We are one people of. This is going to sound corny, but of the color Yale blue. But we are of one color, and I think it really is what binds us and unites us. And we're not just a community of current students, but of alumni. And so I'm so excited to see many alumni here today, especially as we announce a very special gift about which I'm very excited. I won't steal your thunder, but I very much look forward to the presentation coming up. And then just take this moment to congratulate the seniors on your graduation, class of 2021. You are joining an amazing community of alumni, and you're forever members of the Yale community. And the beauty of it is, if your time at Yale fell short, you're going to get to enjoy these bonds and friendships with a community that will last your entire lifetime and your careers. And so you just have even more ahead of you, as rich as what you've had here for 4 years. And again, many of them, thank you alumni for coming here today to show your support for our students and for the AACC. Again, thank you all for getting through this tough year, supporting each other and keeping each other safe. And I think I can promise that next year is going to be better because it's hard to be worse than what we've gone through this year. So on that note, I look forward to the special programs we have today. And again, I thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Dean Chan.
All right, hi everyone. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you to Dean Chan for those extremely relevant remarks. We're really excited to welcome you all to today's programming in celebration of the 40th anniversary of the Asian American Cultural Center at Yale.
My name is Pia Gorme, and I'm a sophomore double majoring in molecular, cellular, and developmental biology and history of science, medicine, and public health.
And my name is Ananya Kumar-Banerjee, and I'm a senior majoring in ethnicity, race, and migration.
I want to start today's event by acknowledging that many of us are on native land. Here in Connecticut, I'm on the ancestral land of the Quinnipiac tribe. I want to recognize the fact that colonialism and anti-Blackness are at the foundations of our culture and inflect the way we live our lives. While I'm delighted to have benefited from the resources of Yale and its subsidiary institutions, it is essential to acknowledge that the bounty Yale and similar institutions simulate for us is allowed to exist because of an ongoing tradition of settler exploitation and racialized violence. This is demonstrated by the triple occupation of New Haven by Yale police, among other practices. I hope you all carry an awareness of this ongoing structural violence with you and use it purposefully, actively contributing to undo their damage in your everyday lives. Today's programming is centered around our theme of celebrating 40 years of dreaming and organizing. First, we'll share some introductory remarks in relation to the theme. Next, we'll be honoring Dean Mary Lee Hsu, Yale College of 1980, former director of the AACC and assistant dean of Yale College. This will be followed by a faculty discussion by Professors Daniel HoSang, Lisa Lowe, and Roderick Ferguson, and facilitated by our Asian American History Fellow, Adi Kumar, and graduate assistant Minh Vu. To mitigate Zoom fatigue, we'll take a 10-minute break, after which we will have a Q&A with a panel of alumni spanning from the 1960s to the 2010s, who organized for the establishment of the AACC alongside former AACC staff. Lastly, we'll view interactive virtual projects that have been created by the planning committee. You'll learn more about how we created the projects and get a glimpse of what you can learn and explore after this program. We'll give some concluding remarks, and from there, we'll officially kick off the 40th anniversary. So about the AACC. The Asian American Cultural Center was founded, in the words of our mission statement, to build a dynamic Asian and Asian American presence at Yale, support student exploration of identity development, and empower them to take an active role in shaping their learning experiences. Today, it is the physical home of Asian and Asian Americans who come from a series of diverse backgrounds to study at Yale. As we all know, though, a house is not a home. 295 Crown Street is more than just two brownstones squished together. It has been a place for us to talk about our dreams, learn about one another, and honor one another during our bright college years.
So as Pia already said, the Asian and Asian American community at Yale is vast and diverse. But we are united by more than a historically arbitrary designation of continental and racial affiliation. The AACC is, more than anything, an example of how political communities can be built to pursue material changes in the university and the world we all live in. This goes to the second portion of today's focus, organizing. Because in order to realize our dreams, we have always had to organize, and we will continue to do so. Going through the archives this past year, we've seen time and time again that the students who preceded us did more than just ask for a physical space to live in. They always looked beyond the center to the rest of New Haven and often the rest of the world. In the 1970s, Asian and Asian American students fought for a positive ruling on the Bakke case, which created affirmative action on the basis of race. In the 1980s, Asian and Asian American students protested Professor Don Nakanishi's denial of tenure at UCLA and fought for the inclusion and expansion of Asian American studies. In the 1990s, we again organized to fight for affirmative action. In the 2000s, we challenged Yale publications and organizations that acted with ignorance. And then in 2015, Asian and Asian American students organized alongside Black, Indigenous, and Latinx students in a coalition called Next Yale. Together, the students of Next Yale demanded that Yale, 1, hire mental health counselors in the cultural centers, 2, establish an ethnic studies requirement, 3, add $2 million to the budget of each cultural center, 4, rename what was then Calhoun College, and 5, enshrine financial and resource-based supports for first-generation and low-income students. But 4 years later, in 2019, students like myself once again organized in solidarity through all the cultural centers to demand that the program in ethnicity, race, and migration, in which I major, be given departmental status to end the quote-unquote subordinate position of ERNM's faculty and scholarship in the university. Because by the time 2019 rolled around, when I was a sophomore and Minh was a junior, the demands from 2015 had not been met. They still have not been met.
Today, we choose to honor this long and storied tradition by once again asking that Yale do better. We recognize that Next Yale's demands, our demands as Asian and Asian American students, have not been met. We add to these demands of the Abolition Alliance at Yale, Black Students for Disarmament at Yale, and the Mental Health Justice Coalition at Yale. Black Students for Disarmament at Yale demands Yale to 1, immediately disarm the Yale Police Department, 2, implement a robust differential response system devoid of police officers by the end of the 2020 to 2021 academic school year, 3, begin defunding the Yale Police Department immediately so it can be dismantled by 2023, and 4, reinvest these funds to support New Haven organizations that protect, serve, and uplift Black and Brown communities.
The Mental Health Justice Coalition has been organizing around additional demands, such as 1, improving access and quality of care on campus by doing things like increasing the default session length from 30 minutes to 60 minutes, hiring more clinicians, especially those who are Black, Indigenous, people of color, Latinx, Jewish, Muslim, Asian, Middle Eastern, and North African, disabled, queer, trans, and/or from a gender minority group. 2, guarantee that every Yale student, regardless of enrollment status, maintains access to a year-round subsidized Yale basic and hospitalization specialty care plan or an equivalent. 3, eliminate the application for reinstatement for medical, financial, and personal withdrawals, including any stipulations on how this time is spent. 4, allow any healthcare professional, including therapists, psychiatrists, and any clinicians, to obtain dean's excuses on behalf of students. This is a practice that's done by the Title IX office, and they're arguing that this should be expanded. And 5, implement a preferred provider organization insurance option, which will give students access to a nationwide network of clinicians with a wide range of backgrounds and specialties, alleviating the demand on Yale mental health and counseling.
When we celebrate today, we honor and recognize the efforts of what came before, but we also dream of a better future. We celebrate 40 years of the AACC with the knowledge that 40 years was just the beginning.
We ask you, in honor of all those years of dreaming and organizing, to dream once more. Dream of a campus where Black and ethnic studies are departmentalized and fully funded, a place where our ideas do not exist at the margins of our university's intellectual life. Dream of a city which is not experiencing ongoing occupation by the Yale police force. Dream of a university that funds more mental health resources and that supports its first generation and low-income students. Today, dream with us. And then, when you're ready, do what dreaming always demands. Organize. Thank you.
And now we'll hand it off to Dean Yi, who will be introducing the special alumni announcement to honor Dean Mary Lee Hsu.
Thank you, Pia and Ananya, for sharing your reflections on the 40th anniversary and what the next 40 years will hold. It is my pleasure to introduce Darren Quan, who is the class of 94, and also a long lineage of ASA co-moderators, among many things, and a great supporter of the Asian American Cultural Center community, to give a special alumni presentation.
Great, thank you, Deanie. Is there ability to share my screen?
Yes, you can do so now.
Great. Let me know when you can see this. Good. Great. So students and alumni, and now soon to be 2021 alumni, indeed a happy 40th anniversary to the Asian American Cultural Center. So now I have the distinct pleasure of announcing a gift that honors a truly remarkable woman for all she has done, nurturing and strengthening the Asian American Cultural Center, demonstrating a lifelong dedication towards the Asian American community at Yale and beyond, and just being an amazing friend to so many. The Dean Mary Lee Hsu Discretionary Fund for the Asian American Cultural Center is indeed a fitting tribute for our dear friend, classmate, alumnus, and former AAC director and assistant dean of Yale College. First, I'd like to thank Dean Chun for approving the creation of this fund and immediately recognizing Mary Lee's contributions to Yale, and to Sarah Dalrymple from the Yale Development Office for being a true champion and advocate in this process. And of course, to Dean Yi for her vision on how these funds can benefit our Asian American community today and tomorrow. So I am thrilled to announce that with just 40 seed donors spanning different decades, we have raised nearly $200,000. And I want to thank you so much for the generosity of all our donors. But it doesn't stop there. Our goal, and you can kind of see here, you can donate it, special designation, is now to raise over $1 million from the nearly 20,000 Asian American alumni, current students, and soon to be alumni in the years ahead. And because this is an endowed fund, it will grow and grow as Yale grows. Your contribution will benefit countless more Asian American students, some that haven't even yet stepped foot through the AACC for many years to come. But moreover, this unique fund, befitting this unique honoree, also has the designated capability to contribute to Yale's commitment towards exploring Asian American academic endeavors and scholarship. This is a significant feature for a fund like this, so please give. Now, this gift is personal to me, and really so many others who have written to me as your classmates and those who are students under your deanship. So Dean Chu, yes, you will always be Dean Chu to me. You taught me that inside everyone is an activist that can advocate for the change that she or he believes in. You also taught me that only as a community, like bringing together the many groups under the AACC, can our collective voices be channeled and heard to effectuate change. And I congratulate our recent speakers that are sharing this spirit. These lessons were so poignant when we were discovering our own personal ethnic identities, evolving and adapting the roles of ASA and fighting for change with the Yale administration more than 25 years ago. And now these lessons are even more poignant today as Asians in this country are faced with unprecedented discrimination and acts of violence. But Dean Chu, you gave us courage. You listened compassionately to us. You believed in us. And in the short 4 years that you were my dean, you have made my whole life better. And for that, I am forever grateful for your mentorship, your emotional support in these formative college years. And I'm not the exception. There's so many that have reached out and expressed how you've influenced and touched their lives too. So Mary Lee or Dean Chu, know that we have all heard you. We felt your presence in our lives. And today and forevermore, we honor you with this fund. Thank you so much. We love you and God bless you.
Thank you, Darren. And it's my pleasure to introduce the namesake of the endowment fund, Dean Mary Lee Chu.
Dean Chen, Dean Yi, Darren Quan, and my dear Yale friends, I am overwhelmed and humbled by this tremendous act of generosity in my name to support current and future generations of Asian American Yale students. I am deeply moved by Darren's vision and initiative, and by the many cohorts of Yale alumni, and by the support of his Yale friends who were students while I was dean. And may I say, may likely remember my frequent exhortations, admonitions on deaf ears to go study. We would also have counter discussions on the marketability of student activism. I'd like to resume that conversation with you, Darren, after we exchange a lot of hugs. As a former first-generation student, this fund brings together access to so many educational options that I have cared deeply about. Your gift allows that. You have done me a great honor by supporting the aspirations of Asian American students through the work of the Asian American Cultural Center. The AACC provides a place for students to find and build community, as you've seen and heard through this great montage and student testimonies, as well as access to opportunities they may not have had otherwise. Travel opportunities, for example, some of which we will be provided through these funds, thanks to you, your gifts. I see this fund as a testament to the strength and spirit of the Yale Asian American community across generations. I have been diagnosed with advanced cancer and cannot help guide the next generation. Thanks to you, this is a gift that this community, you are sending a gift to the future, packaged with love and hope. Let me say that again, packaged with love and hope for our next leaders who are needed, wouldn't you agree, who are needed more than ever. And that's you. Didn't we see these wonderful leaders presenting this montage, what they do at AACC, the majors that they've selected with care, the nights that they've studied at the AACC, and probably also ate a lot of pizza and talked about the meaning of life until 4 in the morning, all of which is important to the undergrad experience. You honor me by perpetuating this spirit of love and hope for greater justice and equity. I know that Dean Yee and all of you demonstrate this every day in your life and work. You have a successful life if you can integrate your values, your skills, your interests into your vocation, into what you call your job, into what you do every day. Or even if you're not paid, are you doing what you think is important? Is it going to help the world? Even if it's just the little corner in which you live, or the world as defined by one person? For that and for the vision and generosity that went into creating this fund, I extend my deepest gratitude. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Mary Lee Shu. Your strength and your grace are so inspiring and gives us all strength, love, and hope in these trying days. And just thank you for being so open and vulnerable and sharing your thoughts with us. And I certainly feel the burden of doing the endowment fund that is being named to honor you, Justice. So thank you for just how kind and gracious you've been since I started this role.
I feel it's been just the other way around, but thank you for allowing me to be as transparent as I felt comfortable. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary Lee. Sending you love and peace. All right, so I think take a deep breath, everyone, and thank you so much, Darren, and all the other alumni for just your incredible support, whether it's financial, your time, your knowledge. Just so much of it continues to be a gift that keeps on giving, and we know we have new alumni who are graduating in a couple of days as well, who will join you in the ranks. And so we're so grateful that you continue to be an extended part of our AACC community. So without further ado, I know we're running a little bit behind schedule. I'm going to hand it off to Minh and Adi, who will be facilitating our first panel event of the day.
Everyone, I first just want to thank Dean Yee, Dean Chun, Ananya, Pia, and Darren for their introductory remarks, which were a wonderful framing to this 40th anniversary event. And I also wanted to just take time to highlight Dean Shu and like to express how grateful and moved we are by your legacy, labor, and love. Thank you for building this history, this space, and this collective spirit for us to continue growing our community. So along this vein, I wanted to transition us to the next part of our 40th event, which will be a panel discussion between professors Roderick Ferguson, Daniel HoSang, and Lisa Lowe, moderated by Adi Kumar, a second-year PhD student in the Department of History, and the AACC's Asian American History Fellow for this semester, as well as myself. So before I turn it to Adi for his opening reflections, I just wanted to quickly thank and introduce our 3 faculty panelists. Also at the end of our discussion, we're going to open it up to a Q&A session where the audience can use the raise hand feature to ask the panelists any questions. Also, if you have any questions that you want to ask anonymously, feel free to direct message me your question and I'm happy to sort of liaise it on your behalf. So to maximize the amount of time for a convo, I'll try to keep the introductions pretty short. So our first speaker is Roderick Ferguson, who is a professor of women's gender and sexuality studies, as well as American studies. His research on women of color feminisms, queer of color critique, critical university studies, and queer social movements has been charted in authored books, including One Dimensional Queer, We Demand, The University and Student Protests, The Reorder of Things, The University and Its Pedagogies of Minority Difference, and Aberrations in Black, Toward a Queer of Color Critique. Our second speaker is Daniel HoSang, who is an associate professor of ethnicity, race, and migration, as well as American studies, with a secondary appointment in the Department of Political Science. Professor HoSang is the author of Racial Propositions, Ballot Initiatives, and the Making of Post-War California, and his forthcoming books include A Wider Type of Freedom, How Struggles for Racial Justice Liberate Everyone, and Under the Black Light, The Intersectional Vulnerabilities That COVID Lays Bare, co-edited with Kimberly Crenshaw. In addition to his role as a scholar, Professor HoSang has a long record of collaboration with community organizations and labor unions, including the Restaurants Opportunity Center, the Alliance for a Just Society, Oakland Kids First, the Partnership for Safety and Justice, and Forward Together. Last but not least, our third speaker is Lisa Lowe, a professor of American Studies affiliated with ERNM and WGSS. She is an interdisciplinary scholar whose work is concerned with the study of race, immigration, capitalism, and colonialism, and who has taught and worked on Asian American cultural politics for several decades. Her book, Immigrant Acts on Asian American Cultural Politics, observes how the long history of Asian immigrants, included as workers but excluded as citizens, was accompanied by the constructions of Asian Americans as perpetual foreigners, model minorities, and enemies at war. Together, Professors Ferguson, HoSang, and Lowe have indelibly transformed the Yale community through their scholarship, mentorship, and organizing. Most recently, the three, alongside Professor Leah Miracore, have collaborated on teaching an Introduction to Ethnicity, Race, and Migration course to incarcerated Yale students of the Yale Prison Education Initiative at the McDougall Walker Correctional Institution in Suffield, Connecticut. They've also worked on an online project called Public Praxis, which is a shared site that disperses and shares the ideas, texts, insights, speakers, and debates of their fall semester classes to wider audiences and publics. So I'll end there to say thank you again to our faculty panelists, and now I'll pass it to Adi for introductory framing remarks.
Yeah, thank you again, man. Are you able to hear me fine? Just wanted to check. I got laggy internet sometimes, and thank you again to Dean Shu for those words. I'm finding myself still reflecting on what you've said, and will probably be reflecting on it for quite some time. I want to start by saying that I feel tired, and I think it's a tiredness that we all share today. You know, the pandemic, recent manifestations of anti-Asian violence, and heightened awareness of ongoing structural anti-Blackness, it's all in the past year contributed to this environment of disorientation. And it's a disorientation, I think, that stems from isolation. You know, both the isolation because of the pandemic that we're in, but also a realization of how isolated we become prior even to the pandemic. Part of it is, I think, because we're here at Yale, which is interesting. You know, the academy is a peculiar space in that it's a conduit to learn about these structural forces and how they've developed over time, how we got here. But the structure of the academy itself almost reinforces a sort of isolation, and isolation to our disciplines, and isolation to our ethnic or racial identifiers, and isolation alongside our fellow colleagues who feel the same way. It's not just that we're separated, it's that we've been separated. And, you know, the question, like others are asking as well, is what do we do? In moments of profound isolation, we should always turn to community. And it's a lesson that we can learn through the archives of the Asian American Cultural Center. It's clear just how much Asian organizers at Yale in the 1970s created community in response to isolation. You know, many of whom didn't just identify as Asian or Asian American, but as third world people. So what is the third world? At its core, the third world is a project about relationships. The project goes back to a conference in the 1950s in Indonesia, where world leaders from decolonizing countries across the global South met to form a system of relationships independent of Western, the first world, and Soviet, the second, forms of power. The third world was later taken up in the 1960s and 70s on behalf of community and campus organizers informed by Black Power movements and anti-Vietnam War protests. And all of these movements helped coalesce and create the conditions for the Asian American movement that we see at Yale and colleges and campuses around the nation. And so this is a coalitional movement. Black, Latinx, Native, and Asian American students learning from each other, organizing alongside each other, and understanding that there's power in numbers. It's an organizing model that's not based in identity so much as it is common cause. So the third world is a commitment then to an unfinished global project. But it was also so much more than that. It was also a concrete, localized organizing tool to connect local issues to global currents, global systems of power, affecting people of color outside the United States' boundaries. So shared structures of power, shared methods of resistance. And third world does not mean that we're all the same. It just calls attention to the relationships that either bring us apart or together, to be pulled into institutional structures or to build our own power across racial identifiers in our community, a notion of community that can be as expansive as we want it to be. You know, people ask, why is this relevant today? Aren't we always talking about race? And the answer is yeah, but conversations about race today are often framed in terms of identity and inclusion. And while it's good, it is necessary for us to identify who we are on our own terms. And over-reliance, I think, on identity and inclusion is often a trap for people of color to individually accept representation instead of collectively demanding equity. I feel like we live in a time where there's sort of a scarcity mindset around racial equity. And the question I'm asking, that I find myself, you know, asking alongside folks who are here today, is how do we find our way back to find our way forward? In other words, how can we bring the ethos and the practice of community building in the third world into the present moment? You know, the good news is that it's already here. There are numerous frameworks today, like abolition groups like BDSY and Abolition Alliance here at Yale, are similar to the third world in that they're creating community, looking to community, forming coalitions in the face of isolation. Communities like the AACC have been restorative and necessary for me to provide a space to build relationships and combat that isolation. But, you know, there's more that we can do. I did my undergrad at Brown University, and in undergrad, we didn't have a Asian American Cultural Center. We just had a third world center, and we organized together. So there's a lot that we can do, that Yale should do, to form more community in addition to what we already have, that doesn't leave us siloed or isolated. And the last thing I'll say is that I'm saying this, and we're speaking in a moment where there's ostensibly a lot of support for the Asian American community, Asian American racial identity, but it's a support that doesn't see us as within community. So what does that mean? It means that we only talk about Asian American racial identity in response to avoidable moments of tragedy, as opposed to decades of protests that warn us about it. A focus on tragedy should not replace a focus on the conditions that produce it, a set of shared conditions that are bigger than what could be slotted into the identifier of Asian American. I think that identity in this way can be used to impose distance, whereas relationship and relationships suggest a condition of possibility on our own terms. And so with that, I'll hand it over to Minh and we can get started with the panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adi. So for Professors Ferguson, HoSang, and Lowe, I guess in the past year, there's been a sort of increased awareness and dialogue surrounding anti-Asian hate all throughout the media, the most salient being the recent shootings of 6 Asian women spa workers in Atlanta. Upon reflecting on the sort of latest coinage of #StopAsianHate, I'm wondering if you three could share your thoughts on the limitations of thinking about state-sanctioned violence through a framework of hate, and particularly within an identity-based discourse.
Dan, would you like to speak first?
I was going to invite you to go ahead, Lisa.
Okay, I can go briefly. First of all, thank you so much for having us. I know time is limited. It's really wonderful to see all of the alumni here as well as students. I wish we could be meeting in person. Of course, just to start out, we're living in a time now of overwhelming racial violence. I mean, not just the Atlanta murders, but also the Indianapolis shootings at the FedEx Center. And then, of course, we've been observing for years now this police violence against Black people. So I think, the question is whether or not anti-Asian violence is new or whether it's not new. I mean, in a way, Asian Americans and Asian immigrants have been facing extreme violence throughout our history in the US. I mean, if you just take I see Mary Lou here. If you just take the late 19th century and the anti-Chinese violence, there were years of mob vigilante assaults, lynchings, arson, with impunity. So I think the question is, of course, this is new. These are new conditions now. But the question is, why do people, actually, our colleague Gary Okahiro remarked to me, why do people think this is new? Why do they think anti-Asian violence is new? In fact, this is it's another version of conditions that have been ongoing. So, I would just say, in response to your question, of course, we want to address this. There's grievance. We're asking for accountability. But the question is whether the accountability from the state should be from, let's say, making it hate crime or enhanced penalties and enhanced criminalization, or whether there are other parts of the state from which we could ask for accountability, like, what if it was stop Asian hate and fund public education, or fund universal health care, or stop, have gun control? And so I think there are many ways in which Asian Americans are asking for accountability for more than this present moment. Dan, would you like to say something?
Thanks, Lisa. I think, and just, yes, I want to echo thanks. I think it was about 2 years ago that, the AACC and the alumni, we were all in, I think, was it like Dwight Chapel? It was in the middle of the struggle over ER&M. It was just so great to be in community then with people to think together about these conditions as it is now. And I'll just say, I think the term disorientation is helpful, and I feel disoriented, and I feel that in my conversations with students. It's like, on the one hand, since last, really January and February, when the pandemic was unfolding, there was something jarring about how swift the genealogies you're talking about, Lisa, and about the associations of anti-Asian violence just moved to the forefront of public action, and the kind of the arbitrariness of both the street violence, just the kind of punchability, right? That it was immediately in people's repertoire, but also the ghosting of Chinatowns. And the New York Times was calling this the Wuhan virus, well before, any of Trump. So it was widespread, and it was so immediately mobilizable, right? It was it was there. And, that obviously ruptures some sense of to the extent that achievement, model minority kind of discourses, people imagine that they're somehow true, that there's some point at which you can be indemnified from that violence, and then the kind of punch and the shot just pushes you out of that. And then the uprisings last summer and the like absolute reminder of the kind of like, you know, kind of just like profound, seemingly like permanence of anti-Black violence and state violence. And I think for like students who identify as Asian American and others, it was a certain kind of like, yeah, disorientation about like, well, what does this mean? What are the connections and what's my role? Like, you know, how do I, and I think, and this is in kind of Adi's remarks and Min's, like the vocabulary we have now is quite limited to help us think about those connections. It's mostly pretty privatized, right? It's about like individual, if we talk about being an ally, or like we talk about individual privilege, or we talk about like how we show up for one another. It's all, it doesn't give us many ways to talk about those structures and histories, Lisa, you know, that you're asking us to think about. And it does seem kind of like this like trade-off notion. Like, what are you gonna do? It's like quite transactional. So I think, you know, the histories that Adi is talking about and that I think Rod is going to talk about, it's like we absolutely need access to other ways of thinking about this that both don't leave us feeling like we can't, the kind of emotions that come with the shots and the punches are somehow like not legible and meaningful and have connections, but they also, to think through the complex ways that they also are related to, you know, to Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and other forms of violence, and then what we might do together in their wake. So I say that more to say, like, I feel like a lot of the work we have to do to, you know, stitch these things together. And that's just the very last thing before, like, I'm looking forward to hearing from Rod is, I think we're going to see some of these archives from the AACs from the early times in the 70s in particular. And I'm just struck at all the work students then did to link concerns about the war in Vietnam with what they were, folks were seeing happening in the Puerto Rican community in Bridgeport, with what, you know, Black radical students were doing on campus and others. No one was saying those are the same experiences. They weren't, but people were trying to work through those. And in some ways, our incorporation into these cultural centers, these beautiful cultural centers that are like, you know, generally well resourced, and these homes, in some ways also do limit us. They do limit our capacity to think about those connections, and not in a permanent way, but just to say that we're left with a whole set of challenges about like producing those together. Rod, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, thanks so much. You know, I think that, you know, the sort of invocation of, you know, something like hate crimes is an occasion for us to think about the ways in which we are related to each other, right? That, you know, there's a kind of emotional rightness to hate crimes, and that's why we oftentimes people want to sign on to it. But, you know, if we step back and we think about the ways in which, you know, hate crimes have actually been used to further, you know, the prison industrial complex, other carceral regimes, the folks who typically pay for that expansion, you know, with their own lives, you know, Black and brown folks, you know, hate crimes as a mechanism become antithetical to exactly what you're talking about, Dan, in terms of, you know, stitching the struggles together. And, you know, as an example, I wanted to offer an example of, you know, early insights around coalition in which, you know, people were thinking about the overlaps between gay liberation, trans liberation, Black liberation, Asian liberation, socialism. You know, I wanted to offer this passage from an essay that I've taught, you know, over the years by the Asian American queer activist and poet Merle Wu, you know, who was also one of the featured writers in the 1981 anthology, This Bridge Called My Back. She's writing this as a letter to a younger Asian American friend who asked her, you know, tell me about Stonewall. This person, young person, is asking Wu on the eve of their graduation from high school, about to enter adulthood, and also as a way for that young person to figure out, how do I enter into a history of social struggles, knowing that Wu was part of one. So this is the part where, you know, Wu is actually talking about the Gay Liberation Front and the Black Panthers, and specifically talking about the GLF, the Gay Liberation Front, and the Black Panther rally in New Haven, all right? And so she says, the GLFs were often explicitly socialist and multi-issue. There were diversity caucuses, a promise of a revolutionary rainbow coalition. A GLF activist spoke at a Black Panther rally in New Haven, May Day, 1970. And while wholly supporting Black liberation, he publicly admonished the Panthers for homophobia, quote, the very oppression that had made so many gay people identify with the Panthers was being reproduced within the Panther movement, end quote. 3 months later, Huey Newton published a letter from Huey to the Revolutionary Brothers and Sisters about the women's liberation and gay liberation movements. Newton wrote, quote, homosexuals are not given freedom and liberty by anyone in the society. Maybe they might be the most oppressed people in the society, but there's nothing to say that a homosexual cannot also be a revolutionary. Maybe a homosexual could be the most revolutionary, end quote. It was incredibly significant that a nationally known Black leader recognized not only the depth of gay and lesbian oppression, but also our potential for radical leadership. Now, Wu also goes on in that piece to tie those struggles to the legacies of anti-Asian violence because of the Chinese exclusion laws, because of Japanese internment. And so what you have in the piece is a model of an Asian American activist and writer trying to do the very kind of stitching work, you know, that you're talking about, Dan, and also the sensitivity to the ways in which our struggles, our circumstances, our histories, as Lisa was pointing to, are different, but they are also overlapping. And it seems to me that that's the kind of fluency that this moment calls for, and that something like, you know, hate crimes don't allow.
Yeah, thank you so much for those remarks, Professor Ferguson. I'm reminded of a Monroe Wu quote, being a yellow feminist means being a community activist and a humanist. And the way that she talked about identity and relationships is always additive. It's always adding, you know, in relationships. And she also said we are Asian American women, and the reaction to our identity is what causes the chasms instead of the connections. Mm-hmm. And you referenced this in your question, but I want to ask all of you, perhaps in the same order, Professor Lowe, HoSang, and Ferguson, you know, how viable is a framework like the Third World in today's moment? Could you talk about movements today or since that moment that focus more on issue-based critiques as opposed to the sort of identitarian identity sort of grounded politics that you all referenced in the last question? So if you could maybe go in the same order, Professor Lowe, HoSang, and Ferguson.
Well, I'm very moved, Adi, by the way, by your interest in the Bandung moment and your taking up this vision of third world solidarity that doesn't render equivalent different struggles for justice, but sees them as necessarily linked. It reminds me a lot of W.E.B. Du Bois's work in which he insists that you know, the Black freedom struggle requires that the vast dark sea of peoples from China and India and the South Seas and the West Indies and so forth all unite together. So I do think it's, you know, all of the students who spoke, Pia and Ananya, for example, are talking about how today, not only in the history of the AACC, but today, for example, in the defund the Yale police struggle, this is a coalition of different groups. It's not about individual identities. It's about a common vision of safety for all people, safety that includes New Haveners and people in Hamden. I just wanted to comment in relation to what Rod said about this, you know, of course, there's been this mass movement calling for more racial justice, and particularly fingering the overdeveloped policing and carceral arms of the state. And so with that in mind, I think as Asian Americans, we need to really be careful about, as Rod's been saying, about how for the hate crimes legislation adds further penalties and buttresses precisely these policing and carceral measures, as opposed to recalling that we were already part of, I mean, we think about a civil rights group like Asian Americans Advancing Justice. We're already calling for more racial justice from the state. So if that state is already in question, we don't want to, buttress those parts of it. But I just wanted to add that it's not just that policing and more prisons and greater criminalization disproportionately affects Black and Brown people, but also Asian Americans ourselves. I mean, after the Atlanta murders, the group Red Canary Song, for example, issued a very beautiful statement saying that, and of course, this is a group that centers Asian migrant women workers, like the massage parlor workers, and emphasizes labor rights and reproductive rights and better labor conditions. And they precisely argued that less criminalization rather than more policing would help the women workers who they organize with, that their workers might be jeopardized by having greater policing, that they don't want to be workers in the informal economy, in forms of labor that are scrutinized. So in addition to being careful about the hate crime legislation because it affects African Americans, I think it affects undocumented Asians as well, and Asians in working class positions. So I think we need to be careful about who we think Asian Americans are.
I would just to build on that. I think that's really helpful, in part because it does seem we're at this moment, like the notion of invitation to support hate crime legislation and coupled with kind of movements for visibility and promises of recognition as an American. They're all about what protections you might, be able to get. And maybe you can be saved from some of this violence. And, for some people who identify as Asian American, I think that will be attractive and people will pursue it. They'll say yeah, this is what that'll mean. I mean, I think that's part of what Lisa's saying. It's as we know, a hugely diverse set of positions that are not going to be characterized by one singular thing. So for some people, there's going to be an attraction to that. And I think part of what Lisa's asking to think about is what cost that incorporation comes at. And I think it comes at the disavowal of a whole set of other folks who also, we imagine as Asian American, who have different experiences that are typically represented at our institutions like Yale, and what our accountability is to them, what our connection is to them, and what other possibilities that don't involve those disavowals. And I just adding to the question about is third world a framework in a kind of abstract way? I mean, I think part of the lessons we'll get when we see those documents are people moved in focusing on what was immediately around them. And I'll just say, very quickly, just take this in Connecticut, in the next couple of weeks, there could be thousands of healthcare workers, nursing home workers, all the people who we celebrated during the pandemic who are likely to have to go out on strike. Because many work 3 jobs at $14 an hour. Most of them are Black and Brown, but not exclusively. Many are immigrant workers. Their lives are deeply, we can trace all the connections to things that about displacement, about militarization, about diaspora. Those are our stories too. And so what's our presence? What's our relationship to them when they say, let's go? And, right now the governor is talking about calling out the National Guard to replace them. this is a much more tangible sense of like what it means. We have, you know, colleagues in community colleges, K through 12 education, who don't have the large endowment to protect them from this crisis. So I think that's the measure of like, what is our relationship to others in those formations? And we're limited in what we are often like allowed to do in the university because we're not encouraged to pursue those connections. So for me, that's what a third world practice is. It's kind of going to where we might imagine, you know, like we're not assigned, and to see and to trace out those, how our lives are present in one another's.
You know, I'll only add that I think that for me, you know, my encounter with the sort of third world spirit happened in the mid-90s in California, specifically at UC San Diego, around the affirmative action struggles, right, on that campus. I was coming from Howard University, as most of you know, is a historically Black college and university. And so UC San Diego was my first time, you know, being in a setting where there were not simply Blacks and South Asians, which I think few people know that South Asians were, after Blacks, the population at Howard. And so it was at UCSD, Blacks, South Asians, East Asians, Latinx folks. And what I saw around those of us trying to preserve and work on behalf of strengthening rather than dismantling affirmative action, you know, was my first glimpse up close of multiracial coalitions. I mean, I can still remember people demonstrating. The student center is called the Price Center. I can still remember seeing students and faculty demonstrating and how richly diverse the crowd was. I mean, I remember Lisa being there, you know, you know, at that demonstration, in addition to folks from the Black Student Union, from MECHA, Asian American students. And that really brought a kind of third worldist coalitional politics home and close to heart for me. And so I sort of offer that to say that, you know, whether we call it the third world or not, you know, its spirit lives in moments like that. And, you know, I think we saw it recently at the abolition rally on Friday to dismantle the Yale Police Department.
Thank you again for all of those remarks. I wish we had time to sit and reflect with each one of them. We want to turn it over to a Q&A with the audience as well. So also want to invite folks in the audience to please raise your hand if you'd like to ask the panel question, or if you'd like to do so anonymously, feel free to message Minh and they can post it to the group. But I want to thank you all again, panelists, for speaking on relationships and where we are now. And I think that something that you said, Professor Ferguson, at the end, you know, affirming rather than dismantling. I think that at the core, you know, what you all are getting at is that, you know, there's a sort of, you know, simplicity, like the closer that we get there, and the more sort of artificial barriers we're able to break down that are getting in the way of that. And I think that, yeah, I'm left with a feeling of possibility after hearing y'all speak. So thank you. And again, please do raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question to the panel. A question that we can potentially get started with in the meantime is continuing on with what you all were saying. You know, what does it mean to embody a practice of community engagement in our roles here at an institution? How can we as Asian Americans, but as anyone really, adopt anti-racist practices that are our communities and for folks outside of that. If we maybe want to go in the same order, Professor Lowe, HoSang, and Ferguson, unless there are other folks in the audience who'd like to ask a question, feel free to.
Well, I think we've been talking for the last 15 minutes or so about the ways in which we have try to engage in our current situations. I was just part of a session last night that Dan hosted as part of the anti-racist pedagogies for K through 12 Connecticut teachers on how to teach Asian American studies in K through 12 classrooms. It was fantastic. There were hundreds of people. And it was just wonderful to not keep what we think about at Yale, but to really think about how we might change how K through 12 education represents Asian American histories and cultures. And then, as Minh mentioned, we're all a part of the Yale Prison Education Initiative. That's one way that we can think, beyond our Yale location, and really to kind of give back to New Haven and Connecticut, since that is part of the society in which we're located. Dan, do you want to add anything?
I'll just say, I learned this term from Rod, but it comes from Jackie Alexander about the need to be fluent in one another's narratives. I think Rod, right? That's, and part of what that is that for almost all of us, the education system we've gone through, and that's K through 12, it's the other places we're socialized, it's even true for most people's undergraduate experience, has left us impoverished. It's left us, maybe in touch with something we might call our story. But often the stories of the people around us who we need to connect with, we don't have those narratives. And part of what I really, take from that comment is that it's a practice. How do you become fluent in other people's narratives? And so this goes beyond kind of multicultural education to really think about the sites at which, whether it's K through 12, thinking about changing curriculum, in our own university as a political project, so that we're Ruth Gilmore calls this so we're fit for struggle. Like that right now, we really don't have the fluencies and knowledges and capacities. We have to work at doing that. And the part of what I've learned through working with the teachers is that's why prosecuting people about what they don't know is not particularly helpful, because many of us don't know what we need to know. So I would just say that that's rather than thinking about how any of this, distinguishes us from other people who don't know, this practice of helping to engage others in sharing these bodies of knowledge is just crucial for everyone.
Yeah, I think that's right. There's this, I'm looking at my bookshelf now, trying to find this book or a sermon in it that I'm going to mention. And it's called Where Thou Art. And it's by the now deceased Black preacher, intellectual Gardner Taylor, who was an advisor to Martin Luther King. And he has a whole sermon about, it's called Where Thou Art. And the idea of it is that where you are now is the opportunity to engage in struggle, right? And, where you are now is the place from which to launch into the world, into the public, into community. And so I've always tried to sort of carry that with me as a kind of ethic that, at the end of the day, I'm a teacher and I'm a writer. Right? And so that's where I am. And so what I have to offer is my experiences and my skills as a teacher and as a scholar. And so, for instance, we've all been talking about for us to launch ourselves into the various publics of New Haven, right? And Dan has introduced me to the Yale New Haven Teachers Institute, where we provide seminars for K through 12 teachers. And from those seminars, they develop units that, for their various grades and classes. And, those are ways in which, you can actively think about what is my location and what can I do from this location, I don't have to dream myself, 5 years hence. Where am I right now and what can I do in this spot?
I would just agree as well. And as, as attached as you are to this third worldist vision, I mean, I think it's very important to be thinking, especially for Asian Americans, to be thinking about how what we live in the US is also connected to what's happening internationally. So even as President Biden is calling for this anti-Asian hate crimes legislation, he's also really beefing up the Pentagon budget and saber rattling vis-a-vis China. So these things are related. But I agree completely with what Rod has just said. We don't, I think we don't want to be too ideological about this. And it's not as if we can seize on abstract examples to dictate, or we're in danger if we seize on abstract examples to dictate what we should do. I really think that the conditions of this past year have been so overwhelming, and we really have to, as Rod was saying, act from where we are.
Thank you so much. But because we're running a bit behind on time, I think we'll sort of wrap it up here to move on to the alumni panel. But I just wanted to thank you all so much, Professors Ferguson, HoSang, and Lowe, for joining the AACC for its 40th anniversary, sharing your remarks and insights, and then being in conversation with Audie and me. So if we could all give a virtual hand to them, that'd be great.
Thank you so much, Minh, Audie, and Professors Ferguson, HoSang, and Lowe. That was amazing. And I think that, yeah, this conversation about coalitions and being able to look at struggles as all being intrinsically connected is obviously a big part of what we saw in the archives. I don't want to hold you guys for too long. So obviously we're running a little bit behind. We will be having a break from now until 5:30. And we encourage you guys to go to the bathroom, take a drink of water, and we're going to drop a PDF with the bios of the lovely alumni who've agreed to chat with us on a panel afterwards. So please do take a look at their bios and start thinking about questions you might want to ask them. But let us know if you have any questions in the meantime, and thank you so much.
History in the making, I was witnessing, listening. Seen this old Japanese lady with a sticker on her walker said, "Free Mumia," and this was before the Trustafarians were saying it. Taking it for granted that you talk about the 60s and never get to talk to anybody who done lived the shit and still exists. Or better yet, she still resists speaking to a myriad of young, dumb, and ignorant kids. I was one of them, stuck around lingering, Said that it's a privilege to meet you in person, and she took my hand, said it's good to meet you too. And when I'm out of school, asked me what I'm gonna do. I had to think about it, but truth is I knew that it was something for the youth and shit. Truly, I'd probably be a teacher if the music didn't make enough to make me wanna gamble on its sustenance, and that's why I'm writing this to tell y'all. From a scholar, when I grow up, I wanna be just like Yuri Kochiyama. Holla, swear to my Kasamas. When I grow up, I wanna be just like Yuri Kochiyama. And if she ever hear this, it's an honor. Cause when I grow up, I wanna be just like Yuri Kochiyama. Tama, serve the people proper. And when I grow up, I wanna be just like Yuri Kochiyama. When I grow up, I wanna be just like Yuri Kochiyama. I seen the picture up in Life magazine. You were sitting front seat for Malcolm's last speech. Saw the first man with the shotgun. Two more came to get the job done. Now who would have thought that it'd be you holding him? I wonder what you felt when his eyes were going dim. And if he never died, would we know that he exists? Or would he been the leader that we always seem to miss? Now there's no taking back whatever happens in our midst. You remind me that it's more than just a martyr and a myth. You could have said it quits many times ever since, and you find there will always be a reason for the fist. The last one to hold him could have been somebody else. You'd still be remembered for the people that you helped. They said to keep trying, but never losing hope. Revolutionaries die, but the revolution don't, and it won't. And I put that on my mama, cause when I grow up, I wanna be just like Yuri Kochiyama. Holla, swear to my Kasamas. When I grow up, I wanna be just like Yuri Kochiyama. And if she ever hear this, it's an honor. Cause when I grow up, I wanna be just like Yuri Kochiyama. Comma, serve the people proper. When I grow up, I wanna be just like Yuri Kochiyama.
Great. Okay, so I think we're going to get started with our alumni panel. I'm really, really excited to introduce the fabulous alumni who've agreed to talk a little bit with us today. So I'll start by introducing them. First, we have Rocky Chin, who graduated with a master's in city planning in 1971, Grant Din, who graduated from the college in 1979, Deanna Midori Matsumoto, who graduated from the college in 1984, Professor Tran, who graduated with a PhD in 2015, and Sohum Paul, who graduated from the college and with a master's in 2020. So yeah, I will hand it off to Pia to get us started with our questions. But as I said earlier, if you have questions for the panelists, please do start thinking of them now, and hopefully we will be able to have time for those as well.
So our first question for the panelists is, what was your relationship with the Asian and Asian American community at Yale, and what spaces were key to sustaining those communities? And anyone can feel free to jump in from the panel.
Well, first of all, I think maybe in terms of sequential timing, it's really important to recognize that early group. I know Alice Young and maybe there's some others are on this. That other panel, by the way, was fantastic. And of course, I think we all want to just send a shout out to Mary Lee Shu. It's just wonderful that we're seeing this fund get started. So with that, I just would like to just say that that earlier group really was really a small group of Asian Americans. Today, I think you said the dean said there was 25%. That's pretty incredible. So just think about that, just in, just in a few years, really. The other comment I'd like to make just before I kind of just talk about what we did in the beginning, which I think has been wonderfully archived and many of you know about it, but is the whole concept about third world unity was very much a part of Black, Brown, Asian, working together, but also taking some inspiration from what was going on globally. But that global dynamic has really changed. So China today is not playing the same role that China did back then. It was a developing country. So I just want to put that kind of out there, that there's really different dynamics. Although I think a lot of the racial and ethnic kind of solidarity is still something that we still want to embrace and talk about, those shared narratives that we have in the United States. So we have this really amazing group of Asian Americans, as you know, that came together in the late 60s, and I was there from 69 to 71. I think you could probably not find a better group of Asian Americans. So the 3 points I'd just like to make is that we put together Amerasia Journal, an Asian American Studies course, and had a conference all, with this small group. So I think we couldn't have done that without working together, without leadership, obviously, and without support from the African American and the Chicano or the Hispanic students also. It's really important to link that early movement with the 1968 San Francisco strike. So, that's pretty much all I want to just say at this point. But we started this whole thing talking about the organizing that AAC has done, and I think that's a theme that we've always seen, and also reaching out to the community, which I think is also very important, because Yale and the Ivy Leagues historically and still today are still seen as Ivy League towers, right? And the community is very important. So all the community work that you guys are doing and talking about is very important. I was just thrilled to be part of that. And of course, now many of us are part of AYA, which is also very supportive of what you guys are doing today. And we want to continue that.
I'm always very honored to be part of the students. I always get a lot of energy and inspiration from anytime I get to meet with the students, whether it's online or when they come out for the externship at Angel Island. I was a definite product of the minority recruitment program at Yale that people like Rocky and Don Nakanishi and folks like that started back in the early 70s, late 60s. And so I was a beneficiary of the admissions program, and also the pre-registration orientation program, which let us get to know a lot of other students of color who were first years, and we were the only ones on campus. So it was great until all the other students showed up. But in terms of involvement, ASA was basically my life at Yale. It was really my major and great and source of inspiration and support throughout the whole time. My floating counselors and folks like that really helped a lot. And so I wanted to stay involved in that and became a floating counselor myself and worked in the admissions office. So it was a time where we were really benefiting from folks like Rocky and Don who came first. And in terms of spaces, we really didn't have too many. There was a tiny little office in the basement of Durfee, and then our small meeting space in the basement of Bingham, where we had our ASA office. It's important to note that demographically, we only had about 250 Asian Americans when we started, compared to what Dean Chun said, about 20%, and which is like 1,000 now. So, or over that because of more colleges. So it was just a great. We supported each other, and so without any serious meeting spaces, we just tried to create our own places to get together. And so in some ways, it was virtual spaces. It was wherever we could get to know each other. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Deanna Matsumoto, and I loved hearing what Grant said because I also love prop. And Don Nakanishi interviewed me, and he interviewed my daughter as well. And he said it was the only two-generation women coming from the same family to Yale. And I also enjoyed hearing all the students speak about their experiences at the with the cultural center. I was able to work at Asian Community Services, and the building on Crown Street had been abandoned, and I had to actually clean up. I think we were on the 3rd floor, and some Asian American students came with me, and we just quietly worked at creating this space. And I think it was a really important time for the town-gown relationships, where students from Yale would be able to learn about the city beyond Yale. That was very important. And I also, what resonated with me with the previous panels was to be fluent in other people's narratives. And I think it was very important for all of us to see, like, for example, who is working in our dining halls and why are they working in the dining halls, and you learn about the Great Black Migration. And then also, since I did work with a lot of refugees, where do the refugees often live? They often lived in the Black neighborhoods. And so you were able to really get a much deeper sense of how history can repeat itself, and how the structures can be very racist because of redlining, for example. And speaking about the history repeating itself, there's been centuries of anti-Asian violence. And when I was at Yale, that's when Vincent Chin was murdered. And we had speakers come, but it was also the Reagan era, because I was there from 1980 to 1984. So the politics on campus could be a little bit more conservative. And I found collaborating with organizations like Dwight Hall, the Social Justice Center, as well as the Women's Center, as well as with the AACC, created a community for me.
Hello, everyone. My name is Quan Tran, and I am a faculty here at Yale. And so some of my students may not know that I was a graduate assistant at the AACC back when, and that's my first introduction to the Asian and Asian American community at Yale. And prior to that, I was coming from UC Irvine, right, and living on the West Coast with a very large number of Asian Americans. So coming to Yale as a grad student was in itself a kind of world-changing experience. And you know, Adi, you were mentioning this notion of isolation, right? So that was a moment of feeling also individual isolation and trying to figure out what is this place, right? I came from a public university, entering a private university. I couldn't figure quite what Yale was like. And so I applied for a job at the AACC as grad assistant, and this was a time under Dean Sabina Dahl directorship. And I think at the time, Yale's Asian and Asian American student population was at about 15%. And so it was through my work as a grad assistant that I got to know Yale undergrads and the campus culture very well. And that actually later on helped me in terms of my training in my graduate studies as a teacher, teaching Yale students. And you know, one of the things that I think was instrumental in the time that I was there was the creation of the graduate and professional school students group, because you know all of us were scattered in so many different places, and it was not that many opportunities to just really get to know each other, get to know Yale through a more communal kind of context rather than right through our own course of studies. And that really helped me personally to get my bearings at Yale. but also creating a kind of structural space in which graduate and undergraduate students can come together and collaborate and connect. And so some of the events that we were organizing in that sense were mentorship events, topical conversations over dinner, and academic talks. So in those ways, we were able to sustain that community and continue to build it over the years. So I'll stop there.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Sohum. I graduated from Yale last year. I was the co-head of the AACC during that year. And prior to that, I had been a historian. Prior to that, I had been involved with ASA. Before I continue, I wanted to just take a moment and acknowledge the ongoing violence in occupied Palestine, namely the eviction of 8 families from Sheikh Jarrah by Israeli settlers. And I just wanted to draw our attention to sort of the interconnectedness of all these struggles. I know a lot of students are pushing for the abolition of YPD, for demilitarization more broadly in response to anti-Black violence. And I think it's relevant that so many police forces around the country are trained and train Israeli forces. And so much of that training and in racial terror is practiced upon Palestinians. So I think that my relationship to the Asian American community was fairly, it was strong. I think like when I came to Yale, I knew I wanted to be involved with sort of like Asian American life. I didn't know exactly what that would look like. And I think that there was sort of a small cohort of students that came with me, like Minh, Janice Jin, a few others, who were trying to sort of negotiate our relationships to being Asian at Yale, and to sort of like the activist groups around. And I think we all did that in really different ways, but I mean, no more or less successfully than the other. So I think the AACC was a really strong source of support for me. I think it also helped me sort of align my own politics a lot, just in terms of like how I saw my commitments to community spaces. But I think the thing that I learned most is that I came to Yale as a freshman kind of thinking that the AACC was going to be this place where I felt like I could kind of like fit, like I was like a puzzle piece, and like here was like a puzzle that I would fit into. And that's like definitively not the case. Not because like the AACC was per se exclusionary, although at times it was, but more so I think just because I came to sort of understand how much labor goes into turning the AACC or any space into a space that is like welcoming and empowering for its participants. And I think that's like labor that faculty have done, that Dean Yeed has done, Shiraz, and just all of the students, both the ones that came before me, and then all of the students that I worked with at the center, and who worked at the center while I was there. So I think coming to understand the AACC as like a labor project is one of the sort of greatest things that I've been able to take from there to sort of my new life as this person working 3 jobs and like trying to figure out my own place in New York. Yeah, so I am very, very grateful to the AACC for that.
Great, yeah, thank you so much. And I think like, yeah, I think acknowledging the importance of Palestinian liberation is like, again, speaking to this idea of like necessarily interlinked struggles, like you can't talk about like demilitarization as sort of Sohum was saying, or even abolition, all these struggles are connected. And I think this sort of goes to our next question for you all, just to give people a scope of the kind of things that Asian and Asian American students have organized around at Yale. Our big question for you is, during your time at Yale, what key issues did you organize around, and what role did solidarity, whether across the country, across cultural centers, or around New Haven, play in your organizing efforts?
I guess we could go in the same order.
Go ahead, Rock.
You know, I think the fact that the AACC and before that the Asian American Student Association, which I know has changed its name a little bit, but you know, we're recognize the importance of being organized and to stand up for different issues. It's kind of interesting to be on this Zoom where you're raising all these different other issues, and I think the great thing, of course, about being an activist and then being on campus is you're starting to be aware of all these issues. For us, during that period of time, we're a generation that came, you know, into college and at Yale after assassinations, after you know, tremendous upheaval, and I think we have to kind of look at these different kind of contexts. So the movement during that period by no means was a small movement. It was pretty big. So today, I think just in reflection, you know, you're going through another movement. I think actually this is a very important time to think about where we're going to go next. But I think one of the things that we clearly recognized was that the criminal justice system, this is something that actually, the issues about fair trial and so forth were brought very, very directly to the students in New Haven because of the Black Panther trial. And I don't think some of us would have kind of really focused on that, but for that. But the other thing I think that kind of shocked me, because, you know, I actually grew up in a very small town in Kentucky, you know, was having tanks come into New Haven and having helicopters coming into New Haven. And so the whole militarization aspect of it's not just the police, but obviously of the government, was very shocking. And shocking because you kind of wonder, like, you know, why did this response happen? You know, why did it have to happen? And then you're a student who's on a campus where a good number of the students fled New Haven. They were literally scared. I don't know how many people are on this Zoom that were in that period, but it was just incredible, especially I would say the more privileged students, which is like 70, 80%, you know, predominantly white students. But I think anybody who just, you know, they thought that New Haven was going to be torn apart by crazies and radicals and, you know, Black activists and so forth. So we learned a lot, I think, during that period that coalition building is very important, and it takes time, and it's not easy to sustain, but it's important.
Well, we were involved in a lot of things, both on and off campus. One thing we realized was that there was a small Asian community in New Haven. So some of our members were involved in the local church, and so we started a small tutoring program, which turned into Asian Community Services after we left. We tried to build awareness on campus a lot of, we brought in speakers, had conferences, and worked in a lot of things we did was work with the other groups of color to support each other. We were involved in, at the time, anti-apartheid movement was very strong. And so in the background is a rally that was on campus outside the president's office where we were trying to influence the Yale Corporation to divest their investments from South Africa. So, you know, it took a long time, but led by folks like Congressman Ron Dellums of California, that had an impact on the situation there. We supported blue collar workers strike when that was going on campus, and off campus we also helped. We were very involved in getting the East Coast Asian Student Union going. The question, I guess, earlier was about coalitions and working together, and we realized that a lot of our issues on campus, other campuses, were relevant to us. We admired the Asian American Studies departments on the West Coast, and I believe Cornell had one at the time, or other schools were starting them, and so we wanted to start our own. And being that there were very few resources on campus, we actually started our own class in Asian American Studies under the direction of one of the sociology professors. And later on, Yale would occasionally have a class or two with a grad student or someone on campus. But when we were there, there's still really no Asian American Studies classes. So we would take African American Studies classes and build our own. Like anytime I had to write a paper, it somehow ended up being an Asian American topic. So those are some of the things we did. We also were involved in when student activity, when we got to campus, there was really no funding mechanism for ASA. And so we had a campaign where we actually we sat at the dining hall entrances and asked Asian American students to sign their student activities fees over to ASA instead of it going to the main pool. And so that was kind of a way you kind of maybe sometimes make some Asian American students a little uncomfortable if they're coming in with their roommates and, you know, not used to anything like this. And they usually do that. It wasn't a lot of money, but it was a small way that we were able to develop some funds for our programs on campus. So I'll pass it on to Deanna next.
I'm going to build upon Grant's again. I really enjoyed reading Adi's virtual museum because it gave me a lot of background about the work that I did with refugees. It gave me the background about how the refugees had come to New Haven and they were resettling at a large rate in 1980. And so I started working with Asian Community Services in 1981 through 1984. So that was seminal for me while I was at Yale and working with a lot of students from ASA, as well as we had a number of Orthodox Jewish volunteers that would come on weekends. And also, ASA was very involved in the redress movement, and we were able to go down to New York to witness the historic hearings for reparations, and that was deeply resonant for me because my family was incarcerated in 3 of them. And also, as something that Grant discussed was recruiting for first-generation students, and that's something that I continue to do in my job now. We would go to Chinatowns, the housing projects, and we would set up a booth and recruit. And that is, beside that and trying to cut redlining is one way to really strengthen the generation of capital being invested, you know, from one generation to the other. And so those lessons that I learned 40 years ago are what I still use now. And one of the problems that we have now with the community colleges for the students is the matriculation rate is very low. So it's still obviously something that we need to work on. And also learning about union issues as well. We worked with MECHA on the Great Boycott in 1984. And that cross-cultural understanding really helped me to understand the historic underpinnings of inequity.
I'll pick up. So I guess we probably skipped the 90s, right? In most cases, in some of the early 2000s. But by the time I was at Yale, student activism, so as we all know, typically have fluctuated over the years, right? Depending on the broader socio-political context off campus, but also on campus. And I think earlier Ananya gave a great overview of some of the flashpoints in her introduction to the event today. And so when I was working at the AACC, it was a relatively calm period, and we have already benefited much from the student activism of the earlier decades that Rocky, Grant, and Deanna mentioned, right? So some of those resources were already available by the 2006. So most of the energy in terms of Asian American student organizing, was devoted around building capacity, delivering programmings, connecting with alumni, and asking for more resources from the Yale administration to match the growth of our population, and also reinforcing institutional memories. And so there were, in that sense, fewer hot button issues and fewer protests that activated and animated student activism in ways that happened in previous decades or right in these recent years. I remember that when I arrived in New Haven in 2006, there was a major protest in New Haven, and it was a part of a nationwide campaign I think it was around May, around immigration reform, and which was just an incredible moment of coalition building and solidarity building that I witnessed in my earlier time at Yale. And then other than that, there were also efforts to build solidarity internally to the Asian and Asian American groups within the AACC by ways of organizing kind of Pan-Asian events, right? So one of those events was the Arts and Film Festival, which showcased the creative work of different Asian American students, as well as professional artists and filmmakers. And we also collaborated with the different cultural centers to bring through a conversation series, which then focus on topics that impact our communities through an intersectional lens. And some of those things include issues of as perennial issues, right, of belonging at Yale as minorities, thinking about immigration reform issues, and pushing for more resources from the administration. So, for example, during this time, the AACC and the Native American Cultural Center shared the same space at 295 Crown. And it was really, a tight space, but both groups had students, increase in student population. And so we worked individually and collaboratively to show the administration of this growth and the need to really make this space commensurate to the population and the services that the students needed. And then I think there were also efforts to think about the institutional memory of the ACC, but also of some of the earlier generation of alumni. And so there were efforts reaching out to alumni from the late 60s, the 70s. So Alice said hi to me earlier on the chat, and Alice was one of the person that one of our staffers reached out to begin to interview and get a sense of what it was like, but also archiving some of these narratives and building that archive within the AACC. And of course, there continue to be efforts in building Asian American studies at Yale. These efforts kind of stop and go, right? Because of the changes in student population over the years. And during that time, and I think there's going to be a question later on about Asian American studies, so I'll stop here and I'll pick up on that later on.
Yeah. So when I was applying to Yale as a high school senior, it was in the fall of 2015. So I think maybe some of the more recent alumni will recall that this was a time on campus, or I mean, honestly, nationally, where there were protests at Yale and Mizzou being two of the sort of more nationally renowned ones around racism on campus. And what it means to be like a person of color at one of these predominantly white institutions. I think one of the legacies that I inherited, or I guess that like we inherited as I was coming into college, was that Asian American students had not really acted together as a body. And there was sort of this sentiment that I remember hearing a lot as a first year student that was like, oh, well, like in 2015, the Asian American Students Alliance like failed to release a statement condemning whatever, or like joining next Yale. And there was just a lot of sort of, I think, justified suspicion around sort of like Asian American students' commitment to racial justice and interracial solidarity. So I think a lot of my time at Yale, like students were trying to repair that relationship with other communities of color. And so I know that while I was there, we started doing like intercultural staff trainings. That might have actually been prior to when I started, but we were doing intercultural staff trainings. There were like multiple somewhat aborted attempts at like intercultural sort of like council situations with like ASA, Mecha, Bise, and Ane. I think one thing that did kind of bring us all together, well, two things really that happened simultaneously, were that in 2019, I believe, we had the sort of like ethnic studies crisis that I think Ananya mentioned earlier. And we were all fighting for ethnic studies in like a really profound way. And simultaneously, there was the shooting of Stephanie Washington and Paul Witherspoon by YPD in Hamden. So I think that students were we kind of were brought together on these two issues. And I think that more so perhaps than had been true prior to 2016, Asian American students, ASA, and other sort of related bodies were really fighting to show up. I feel like that was like a kind of motto for a lot of students, was just like, show up, like come out. Yeah, and I have also some thoughts about Asian American studies, but I will save those for the next question as well.
Yeah, thank you all for all your reflections and like sharing all your experiences surrounding organizing and solidarity. That's definitely something that Ananya and I like picked up as we went through the archives, and something that's continued today. And so, yeah, as Grant, Professor Tran, and also Sohum alluded, our next question is related to Asian American studies. And so this question is, what did students think of Asian American studies during your time at Yale, and how did they fight for it? And how did you situate Asian American studies within third world studies at large?
I think there's been a lot written, and Alice is on this. I don't know, Alice, if you want to chime in, because the class that was started was really an undergraduate. I was in the graduate school, so effort to put together a class. It just shows that students can put together an academic class. They got a professor to head it up, but that was one of the first Asian American studies classes on the East Coast. I forgot to mention that one of the other activist leaders back then was Glenn Omatsu. He was a graduate student, and Glenn has been a phenomenal advocate for Asian American studies, particularly advocating for reaching out to communities, clinicals, things like that. And I don't think he's come back to Yale very often, if at all, since he left, but we tried to get him for the other anniversary we had. But I think the one thing I'd just like to leave here is that Yale students had a big impact on the formation of Asian American studies, just in terms of creating that course. And it wasn't the first Asian American studies course in the country, but it was the first course really on the East Coast. And many of us went on to, I taught a course also at Hunter, and of course I know Grant has done. I think the thing is that what's really phenomenal is a lot of the students who were at Yale during that time and continuing have done some phenomenal stuff and continue to do that. So whether it's Asian American studies or being involved in leadership in the Asian American community as professionals and thought people, I think that's something that's really been a tradition, very important in terms of the continued advocacy around Asian American studies. But I'll pass it to Grant.
Yeah, I think when we tried to co-teach our class, we did see Asian American studies in the context of what we still then called Third World Studies, and the need to learn from different causes and things like the impact of the civil rights movement on the Asian American movement, and issues like that were really important to us. There was a class at Yale called Sociology of either minority groups or ethnic groups, and Professor Melvin Boozer, and he was really good for some of us in terms of understanding the connections between the different groups, and that colored the way I think we tried to approach our class. And as Rocky mentioned, after Yale, I was working at Oberlin College and taught in experimental college, and so things I learned at Yale and from the other third world class programs and definitely had an influence on me. Deanna?
I remember that ASA sponsored a lot of talks. We had poets coming. We had a discussion once again about with Vincent Chin, his murder. So I think that was the precursor to a lot of the classes. It was the organizing of these sessions to discuss and learn more. And also there are a number of Asian American women that we learned a lot about Asian American women's studies actually from the Women's Center, is it was also the time of a lot of men dying from a disease that nobody knew what it was at that time. And that was the AIDS crisis. And so once that cross-pollination between organizations at Yale was very powerful.
Yeah, and so my time at Yale, the Asian American Studies Task Force was, at the time, focusing in terms of activism on just getting people to enroll into courses that were already there. So by the time I arrived at Yale, Yale had Professor Mary Liu, who was attending this event earlier, as the key faculty who was teaching Asian American history and Asian American women and gender history classes, right? So one of the strategy is that we have these classes now, can we fill them? And that was part of the energy. By 2008, Professor Lisa Lowe had arrived, but she was only there for a year. It was a temporary situation. And so during the time, students continued to think about Asian American studies as a major and what that would look like, and whether to pair it up, right, with ethnicity, race, and migration. And I think some of that conversation continues today, right? What makes sense in terms of Asian American studies as a major at Yale. And then some of the efforts that students were continuing to build on previous efforts included, right, bringing guest speakers, highlighting Asian American scholarships and faculty from other campuses. And the other thing too is thinking about, right, Yale, by the time I got to Yale, it was only Mary Liu who was an Asian American NIST. Before that, there was Sandra Nguyen, but she didn't get tenure. So the question of retention was also something that students were keen on, and trying to figure out how to ensure that the university really pays attention to not just having courses, but ensuring that these courses are sustained over time and that the people who teach them are retained, right, and not on an ad hoc kind of level. And so before we get to this moment where there is now critical mass in terms of Asian American faculty, Asian American studies was really held down together by Mary Liu on this campus.
Yeah, and I think that even as I came into Yale, that was very much still the case, was that Professor Mary Liu was kind of the only Asian American Studies faculty member. When I had left, I think WGSS and anthropology and a few fields with professors of color had lost faculty, including I believe Karen Nakamura, who had been a disability studies and Asian American Studies faculty member. But also I think after 2015, there was kind of this boom in Asian American Studies faculty. I mean, we got like, Professor Lowe came back. We hired like Grace Cow. There was just really like a large number of faculty that came. But that was frankly paired with a loss of faculty in other programs, specifically AFAM, African American Studies, sort of lost a lot of faculty members, especially allied with history. And I know that that's one of the problems that's currently being remedied currently with current sort of faculty searches. But actually there's some really wonderful African American Studies faculty that have just joined. But yeah, I think that like Asian American Studies was less of a focus by the time I was like a sophomore or junior, because we had just seen this big boom in faculty and Asian American Studies offerings. The ethnic studies crisis, I think, was in part about sort of the inequitable distribution of ethnic studies sort of programming, in terms of a lot of it was sort of Asian American focused or Chicanx focused, and there was really not a lot with like Indigenous studies. I think this might have changed, but at the time, I think Ned Blackhawk was the only tenured Indigenous faculty member and only faculty member of Indigenous studies. And I think the question of how Black studies fits into ethnic studies is one that continues to be very contentious and troubled at Yale and sort of more broadly in the academy. Yeah, but I think Asian American Studies is not really the focus so much as like ethnic studies more broadly. And I think that we've sort of, I think there's some nostalgia for the third world studies framework, but I think some of it maybe is a little retrograde, and perhaps there's a unwillingness to think about what comes next. And there's sort of just this dangerous nostalgia for the past, but that's kind of my personal opinion.
Yeah, I think that that's so true. I'm like, part of the reason why we asked this question was that there was like an AAPI spread in the YDN, which was so nice of them. That was a joke, everyone. But they had an AAPI spread, and one of the questions was like, is Asian American Studies still relevant, right? And I think, so I'm thinking a lot about like what Sohum says, like as a current senior, right? Like, I think as someone who like did their thesis focusing on like border studies, specifically in South Asia, I think that like the interdisciplinary and also like transnational nature of like at least the way the program in ethnicity, race, and migration is like intended to function was like extremely beneficial for me. But like going back to this idea of like coalitional strategies, just in terms of organizing, but also in terms of our education, I think that like one of the classes that was so important for me coming into Yale, being a sophomore in Yale, who did not plan on being an ER&M major, was I took a class called Intro to Third World Studies with Gary Okahiro. And I think that's like why the third world framework, even if it's not necessarily the most precise framework for our current moment, is one that like is still increasingly compelling, because it is so effective at like articulating the commitments that we have to have to these other fields of studies, which are like related. And like, I think it's very easy, for example, to be like, we should enshrine Asian American Studies as like a separate major, but then you have the separation of Black studies and Latinx studies and Indigenous studies. And I think like as an ER&M student, like the stress about like how Black studies is not necessarily as incorporated within the program is something that has been talked about a lot. But it's certainly true that like going back to this idea of being fluent in one of another's narratives, you can't expect to be fluent in another person's narrative if you don't know their history. And that history, I think what we're all really saying in many ways is that the history of Asian Americans is the history of all people who are looking for a more progressive future. You have to know as much as possible about what it means to struggle for a better future in all communities in order to be able to look.
Yes. You mentioned Gary Okahiro. So first of all, I think AACC has to really acknowledge the phenomenal generosity of Gary Okahiro. And I've always felt that, you know, with the collection that you have, that really needs to be integrated into Sterling or somehow. You know, it can't be just marginalized. The university really needs to step up and do something. But I want to just throw out that David Yu over at UCLA has been charged with linking the ethnic studies programs with policy. And you know, I think that's very important that whether it's Asian American Studies or ETRM, whatever, not just be this kind of like, you know, purely academic kind of whatever, you know, academic department, that it actually links up to policy studies and communities and data that comes out, because that's one of the things that really gives it a lot more clout, actually. And you know, the problem with Asian American Studies, and I'm just kind of putting out my own view, but it's oftentimes there's been a heavy emphasis on cultural studies and not so much on social science, you know, or immigration and those kinds of issues. And that was, I think, deliberate. You know, the universities just thought, okay, you know, you can learn about novels and so forth. And I'm not trying to diss, you know, people who write novels, but I think we have to think about that in terms of the resources. So my feeling is there needs to be a lot more pressure on universities to link it up with policy studies, with communities, with relevant data, and obviously I think we're at a lot better place than we were, you know, when we started. But Yale still is, in my opinion, is lagging, you know, in terms of. I think this period, that the last couple of years where there's been demonstrations, we need to keep that going. It's really one of the few signs that there's maybe a breakthrough going on, I think. But I think that's really important, and to link it up with the other struggles, because you know, it doesn't, you know, Yale doesn't just operate within a vacuum.
Yeah, I thank you so much for that comment, and I think that is very well put. I think like one thing I might say, and then I will pass it off to our project presenters to talk a little bit about the kind of work that they've been doing sort of in preparation for the 40th, is just to say that like I think one of the things that is so important is like even within the realm of cultural studies, right? I think that like things have to be tied to like material change. And I think that sort of, as you noted, like the work of universities like Yale is to like get us so hooked on the importance of abstractions that we forget that even as we're learning, even if you are reading novels, right? Like there has to be some sort of form of commitment to, you know, making a better world, even if you are just someone who reads books. And I think that, like, for example, Professor Ferguson and Professors Lowe and HoSang mentioning their commitment, for example, to the Yale Prison Education Initiative or organizations like that, or even this organizing around the abolition of the Yale police force, is the kind of thing that has real material changes and is really very much like a redistribution or use of Yale students' power, hopefully in a way that will benefit more than just the people who are already within this like elite kind of class. But yeah, I don't want to drag that on for too long. But yeah, again, thank you so much, all of you, for your wonderful comments and for sharing your experience with us. And we really tremendously appreciate it. But I think, yeah, I'm going to hand it off to our presenters. And I hope you all are very excited to see their projects. I know that they've been working very, very hard on them. So yeah, thank you so much again.
Ananya, can I say something really quick?
Sure.
We just want all the alumni want to wish Mary all the best. And she was really instrumental in getting the Cultural Center going behind the scenes in the early days too. But we send our love to Mary, so take care.
Yes, thank you guys for all of your words and sending big, big love and support to you all. The 40th meetings have been full of laughter and hype, and I am incredibly proud of everyone that has put work into their projects. I'm just going to hand the mic off to Addie to present the virtual museum for the sake of time, but very, very proud.
Yeah, just echoing what Sanara said. I mean, thank you again, Ananya and Pia, for organizing all of this and for that great panel. It was so great to hear from all of you. Wish we had more time to speak, but for the purposes of brevity here, the virtual museum is one of many projects that we've been working on here at the center. And so it's a multimedia collection of oral interviews conducted with a lot of the folks who I see here today: Deanna, Grant, Rocky, Alice, Naomi. It's great to see y'all. It's like supposed to be, or plans to be, sort of a project of community, in the sense of we want to document and are trying to document things like Alice, I know you mentioned May Day and the Panthers, which is covered in the museum. Thanks to alums like yourself that are donating your time, photographs, any archives that you have. And so this is really just a call for alums. I know Stephen mentioned in the chat, is there a place that we could submit things? If we have archives, old photographs, I'll send a link in the chat, and folks are welcome. Anyone who's affiliated with this community is welcome to submit on that website, so we can continue to add to what we have and to document the history of the AACC and also all of the spaces that made the AACC possible. The last thing I'll say is that this is a project about space, community, and the relationship between the two. I think that everyone who's spoken here today has done such a great job of encapsulating those ideas.
Thank you so much, Addie. Very astounding and important work. And yeah, if the other members of the committee could also just drop the links to these projects as we go, that would be much appreciated. My name is Tanera, and I've been working on a timeline to update the Our Story page of our website. It is published on there right now, so feel free to rifle through as I speak. And as has been evident by the discussions in this meeting, the story of the Asian Center is really a story of people. It is a story of students, faculty, and community organizers coming together to fight for the recognition of our existence. The timeline is in no way an exhaustive account of resistance on campus and in New Haven, especially considering that our work is not over. I have definitely gotten a newfound appreciation for archival work while putting this together, although it is sometimes an overwhelming mix of emails and sound bites and advertisements for events. The archives have put together a history starting from the first Asian who got their bachelor's from Yale, Youngwing, to our family today. And we've talked a little bit about Don Nakanishi and how he really pulled Asian surnames from a phone directory to invite Asian students out to dinner. He was inspired by the Black and Mexican American student organizations at Yale doing the same thing, and also really started from this group of 35 Asians who would later organize to bring up the lack of low-income Asian students at Yale, start the first Asian course here, and demand more institutional resources, including counselors and platforms such as magazines on campus. And the Asian population at that time, as has been mentioned, didn't really represent people who looked like me, for example. In 1972, when we were moved to the one office room of Durfee Hall, the 250 Asians on campus were mainly made of Chinese, Japanese, and Korean Americans. While we have made strides in including South and Southeast Asians, just looking at the 40th committee alone, there is definitely more work to do. And meaningful representation is especially important to combat things like imposter syndrome. And the Asian American movement is not an isolated movement. You cannot talk about its history by neglecting multiracial solidarity. The Black Power movement's emphasis on anti-imperialist agendas and recognition of racial and economic disparities in housing and labor have influenced the Asian American and Chicano movements greatly. And the Third World Council at Yale, including ASA and MECHA, would work together to fight against so many things. And just one last thing that I'll mention, I think all of us are familiar with the shoe story, where President Bart Giamatti had gone to meet with ASA in their office in the basement of Bingham in 1978, and everyone had taken off their shoes as is usually custom, and Giamatti could barely get through the absolute ocean of footwear. Evidently, ASA had needed a new and bigger space. After which Vito de la Cruz, a student that was a part of MECHA, called up ASA to join forces and lobby for a mutual space, and Dean Chavez would find a building on 298 Crown Street, which ended up needing $20,000 in repairs. And Dr. Chavez and Francisco Leal, who graduated in '83, would really take up the brunt of the work to fix up this place, really rolling up their sleeves. Yale only fixed the plumbing, electricity, and the primer on the walls. But at the end of all the flurry of letters back and forth about this building, at the end of all the sweat and physical labor put into making the AAC habitable, we finally had a space big enough for our shoes. I'm going to pass the mic on to Rusty now, and the rest of the math crew, including Minh. They've done a wonderful, wonderful job. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanera. Thank you to everyone on the 40th Planning Committee, and to all of our wonderful speakers and guests here today. I'm going to be talking about two of our math projects that were created for this anniversary. As the members of the Planning Committee reflected upon 40 years of dreaming and organizing, we pondered the ways in which we could think about histories in other dimensions. Yes, stories happen temporally, but they also occur spatially and relationally. Histories weave webs, and we wanted to show how continuities and changes occur on local and macro levels. That's sort of the basis here for these cartographies of dreaming and organizing. We wanted to show how stories are intertwined with place and space, and so we came up with 2 multimedia digital maps. The first map you see here was my personal project. I was really fascinated by the origins of the AACC, how protests carved a space here at Yale for Asian Americans, and how it really was a space created by and for students. And as it turns out, this was not a unique story. By and large, ethnic studies programs, Asian American studies programs, and Asian American culture centers were born out of this same activism and protest. On the West Coast, you have the Asian American Activity Center at Stanford, the first cultural center for Asian and Asian American students. Predating this is the Paul Robeson Cultural Center at Rutgers in New Jersey, the first ever cultural center which was created to serve the African American community and really laid the groundwork for spaces like the AACC to exist. And the establishment of the Asian Student Center in the South at Emory University in 2021 shows the fight is still ongoing and is still led by students. As you browse through the different points, I hope you can see how our stories are connected, and most importantly, how we can help each other with this fight. I'll now turn it over to Adi so he can introduce his local map.
Yeah, so this is a compliment to the map that Misty made, which is really a map of activism here on campus in the past 50 years, sorted by chronology. And, it's an effort to show in, mapping these 2 maps onto each other that, something that you've all addressed today is that the local is the global, is the national, is the local, and we find ourselves here at the end of the day, in physical space with people that we see, in our day-to-day. And, I think making these maps and, learning from each other helped us see how much that was going on here at Yale was going on in other schools, and what that meant in terms of, I think the team who's worked on, these projects for, I think bringing us together, because I think that, projects like these, the goal is to remind us that we are in community, spaces like these are community, and where we are, both our physical location and our relationships to each other are things that we really want to keep in mind. And so to that end, the maps are really just reflections on space. I'll turn it back to Ananya and Pia.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. These projects are so amazing. I think one thing I just want to briefly add with regards to the MAPS project, which was done is so incredible, is that this was really inspired in many ways by Indigenous scholarship, thinking a lot about how going back to imperial logic precedence is a really big part of colonial justification, also scientific justification. And there's an Indigenous scholar, I forget, I think it's not Kim Tallbear. I will remember the scholar's name and get that name to you all. But I think it's important to think about how can we think about justifying or giving our community legitimacy in a way that does not enshrine and protect colonial and imperial logics. And so I think that was a really big part of why space is so important. And also thinking about the center itself, right? This is very much a place that sees its legitimacy through the physical community that is created. And so in the same way, how can we look for legitimacy through spatial and communal understanding? But yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for that. And I think we're going to move now to our closing remarks. Pia, if you would like to pick it up.
Yes. As we close and officially kick off the 40th anniversary celebrations, we have a lot of people to thank to make this happen. First of all, we want to thank Deanie for your continued guidance throughout planning for this anniversary and as leading the AACC, as well as Shiraz also with his continued support as assistant director of the AACC. We also want to thank all the alumni who are part of our panel: Rocky Chen, Grant Din, Sohum Paul, Deanna Matsumoto, Professor Quan Tran, and then also with Darren Quan with honoring Dean Mary Lee Hsu. We also want to thank the professors on our faculty panel discussion, Professors Daniel HoSang, Roderick Ferguson, and Professor Lisa Lowe, as well as the amazing 40th Anniversary Planning Committee, who literally has been an amazing team to work with. Sunera Suba, Adi Kumar, Resi Funan, Minvu, Andrea Lee. Y'all have been amazing people to work with, and this event would not have been possible without you. And thank you for, entrusting in Ananya and I for, helping to commemorate the 40th in a very meaningful way, especially, within the pandemic and things being virtual, still creating this space that's, really meaningful for everyone. And lastly, we'd like to thank the audience for, staying on for two and a half hours with us. And, we're really excited to continue celebrating the center, and that has meant so much to everyone, and looking forward to the future. And stay tuned for hopefully in-person celebrations next year. And also feel free to reach out to us if, if you have archives to pass along to us, and to continue working on these projects. And be sure to check out those virtual projects. They're really amazing, and the team has been working really hard on those. So yeah, with that, officially, kicking off the 40th anniversary, and thank you all for your time and energy today. Really appreciate it.